today is going to be your quick start guide to setting up testing in your Next.js applications. We're going to cover how to do end-to-end as well as component tests using Cypress for your Next.js app. So we're going to use a starter project that I have already created here. And then we're going to kind of go through this manual setup article that Next.js has. I've been using Cypress for years now in a production application. So I'm also going to share some of kind of the main things that I've learned on how to use Cypress and get the most out of it. So what we should do first is let's go ahead and clone this repo. So I'm going to grab the code here and I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to head over to Visual Studio Code and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a new directory. So I'm going to do make dir. I am on a Mac computer here as well. I'm going to make dir and then I'll say next testing and I'll cd and testing. And then I'm going to do git clone and then paste that URL. So now that I have this clone, I'm going to go ahead and go into file, open, and then open this within VS Code. So I now have this project opened, and anytime you clone a new repository, it's always good to install all the packages. So go ahead and open your terminal and run npm install. So now with that, let's start our project and I'll give you a basic rundown of this beautifully styled project here. So go to localhost 3000 after running npm run dev in your terminal. And then you should see this at localhost 3000. So you see this beautiful homepage with a ton of helpful content on it. This sidebar here in which we can navigate to different pages. So here's the about page that has this beautiful and very intricate counter component. And then here we can go to a settings page and we see a to-do list component and so on and so forth. So very, very basic application, but we do have a couple of components here and we have some navigation here that's going to allow us to test our application a little bit. So let's now start to get Cypress installed here. And fortunately, it's really not too difficult. So we're going to first run npm install -d Cypress. So I'm going to copy this and you can see where I'm at in the docs here. If you want to copy this as well, here at the top of my page. But I'm going to go ahead and open a new terminal and then install this package. So we have now installed Cypress here. And then scrolling down, Next.js recommends that you add this to your scripts in your package.json. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this line of code right here that I've highlighted, head over to our package.json file. And within the scripts here, I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. And then if we come back, I should be able to now run npm run Cypress :open, and we'll go ahead and run that in the terminal. So what you're going to see here is it is going to open up a Cypress runner. I am not going to watch this. I guess I'll just click continue, and then you'll see this kind of pop up right here. I'm going to go ahead and close this for a second here, and then we'll just see so here it says you can choose to configure end-to-end testing or component testing. Selecting any of these options will automatically create the Cypress config file. This says to ensure that your end-to-end tests have this. So let's go ahead and open that up again and let's click end-to-end tests. And then it's saying, okay, we're going to add all of these files to your project. I'm going to say, yeah, that's cool with me. I'm going to click continue. And then now it's going to say start end-to-end testing in Chrome. And I'm going to click on that. So here is the Cypress test runner, in which Cypress is pretty cool because it will literally run your application in the web browser, which means that you're going to be able to use the web browser to debug your tests, to find certain elements, and to run your different tests. So it's pretty neat how it works. But let's come back here to what it says here. So it says to check the Cypress config. So let's go ahead and so you can see Cypress is now running here. But I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So here we have a Cypress config and it says set up node events on config. And then it should say end to end. And it does indeed say that. So we can check the box there and says then create 2 new Next.js files. We're not going to do this because we already have some files that we can test. And then here it shows kind of setting up the tests here, which we can do in just a second. And then it talks about running the test. So let's just go back to the Cypress test runner here. And I'm going to click create new spec. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a new folder within Cypress /end-to-end. We can name it whatever we want. So for our end-to-end test here, we're just going to test navigation. Now I'm going to click create spec. You can see the basic structure of a Cypress test is your entire file is going to be in a describe block. So that's like your overall testing category. And then you can have individual end-to-end tests within your describe block. So you can have it, passes, it visits the homepage and it succeeds. You can have one test that's that. You can have another it block that tests your navigating to the about page, another one navigating to settings, so on and so forth. So your it blocks are different individual tests. Now, Cypress does recommend in their docs, and I have a full course on Cypress and JavaScript, so I'm not going to cover every little detail, but they do recommend, especially in your end-to-end tests, it can make sense to just write longer tests and not a bunch of small individual tests, as with end-to-end tests in particular, you might have to do a lot of setup when it comes to logging a user in and cleaning up state and stuff like that. So it can be better with end-to-end tests to just write single larger tests, but it's not a huge deal for our context right now. So you can see it just set up this example test to where it went to example.cypress.io, but as you can see, this is not actually testing our own application. We actually went to test localhost 3000 because our project is now running on localhost 3000. But you can see here in the Next.js docs that it recommends that you can use site.visit and then a relative path instead of HTTP localhost 3000 by adding base URL HTTP localhost 3000 to the Cypress config file. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this here. And then in our Cypress config, I think I added outside of end-to-end here, like so. And then I will come back to our end-to-end test. And instead of visiting this page, we'll just visit our home page. And then I'm going to rename this to navigation tests. And you can see base URL configuration option is now invalid when set from the root. It needs to be within end-to-end. So let's go ahead and fix that. Cypress config. Let me grab this and I'm going to paste it right here. So now if I try again, we see we got a weird pop-up Chrome here. I'm going to just click got it. And now we see that it does indeed visit the homepage of our application running on localhost 3000. So like I said earlier, what's really cool about this is I can use this just like it's my app on localhost 3000. I can open my sidebar here. I can go to my settings page. I can go to my about page. I can interact with all of this, and I can even inspect my page and see my different elements that I can use for testing. So this is a really cool part of Cypress that I especially like. Now, we need to write our end-to-end test, which might bring you to the question, when do you use end-to-end tests compared to component tests? And Cypress, at their guides /core concepts /testing types at their website, has a kind of cool breakdown of end-to-end tests versus component tests. So it says the benefits of end-to-end tests are they ensure your app is functional and is cohesive as a whole. So you test overall workflows and make sure that everything's working together well. Your tests match a user actually using your application rather than some individual isolated test. Can be written by developers or QA teams, can be used for integration testing as well. Now, considerations for end-to-end testing: more difficult to set up, run, and maintain, more challenging with a CI environment, and testing certain scenarios might require more setup. So, making sure that you have users in your database that are logged in that you can use, or users that are in a certain state that you can test a certain workflow because they're in that state. All of this takes a little bit more setup. Here it says common scenarios for end-to-end testing: validating critical workflows like authentication and purchasing, ensuring data is persisted and displayed through multiple screens, and running smoke tests and system checks before deployment. I don't know why I said smoke tests the way I said it. But then here for component tests, it mentions, basically the opposite. It's like easier to test components in isolation, fast and reliable, easy to set up, specific scenarios. You don't rely on external systems. But the downsides is that it doesn't test like complete workflows or ensure everything works together. It does not call external APIs, and usually it's developers writing it. So here they kind of give a breakdown of a comparison between the two. So end-to-end, it tests all app layers, versus component is just an individual component. End-to-end tests are usually slower, more susceptible to flakiness, but they're also more comprehensive, whereas component tests are quick, reliable, but also more specialized and less comprehensive. End-to-end tests are good for verifying app works as a whole. Components are more so testing functionality of individual components, and, no CI needed, whereas this could have some complex setup. And even for initialization, they're slightly different, to where for a component test, you need to mount your component to the browser. Before an end-to-end test, you just visit the homepage of your application, because it really is just running your application in the browser. So those are some core differences there. And for like our application here, we're just going to test navigation and like the whole workflow of someone navigating through our app. So making sure that our sidebar opens and that we can go to our homepage, and then clicking on about goes to our about page. I feel like that's a fairly decent use case of an end-to-end test, testing that kind of navigation workflow throughout our application. So to do this, let's now head back to our Cypress test runner here. And what do we want to do here? Well, within our test, the first thing, we're going to land on our homepage here. So the first thing that we're going to want to probably do is like open our sidebar. So to open our sidebar, we're going to want to have the user click on this like hamburger button. And then, maybe we'll just first have them click it, open, and then close the sidebar and make assertions in between to make sure that it's open. So let's come back to VS Code here. And in our test, we're going to visit our homepage, and then we need to kind of grab our sidebar. So we'll go to components and we go to sidebar and we look at it here. Well, we have this button here. Well, what would be an easy way for us to select this button? Well, I think the easiest way in this case is going to be using a data attribute. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a data-id to this HTML element. And this is just going to be called open sidebar btn. So we're adding this data ID attribute here. And in Cypress, if we inspect our page and we look at this button here, we should see it has this data ID attribute of open sidebar button. So now in our test, when we visit our homepage, we can now say sci.get. This is how we can get an element in Cypress. Well, what do we pass to sci.get? Well, this is any sort of CSS selector. So it works just like a CSS selector. So we're going to get a data attribute, so square brackets, and then I'm going to paste in data-id equals our open sidebar button. So this is saying use a CSS selector to get this element. And then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to click on this button. So let's come back. I'm going to refresh this to rerun our test. we see Cypress, it gets our element and then it clicks on it. And you can see over here on the left, it shows us the workflow of what it's doing. It visits the homepage, it gets this button, and then it clicks on it. And then you can see it opens these elements. For these elements here, well, let's kind of come back here and for our sidebar. So if our sidebar is open, then we show this div. So let's actually add a data ID to this div and just say open sidebar. So now what we can do is if we come back to our test, we can say sci.get, and then I'm going to do our data -id is equal to, I think I did open sidebar. And then we can also make an assertion here. So I can say, we can chain onto this. We're going to get the element and then assert it should be .visible. And all these assertions can be found on Cypress. I do have these memorized though, because I've been working with Cypress for so long. So we're going to open the sidebar and assert that it is visible. So let's go ahead and rerun this. And we can see it expected this element to be visible, and it is. Now, one good practice with testing is that we assert that it's not visible as well. So before we click on the button, we can assert it should not be visible. So let's go ahead and, okay, so it gets an error here. Okay, so this is kind of a tricky part of Cypress if you've never seen this error before. And trust me, I have, because I've written a lot of errors in Cypress. So it expected this to not be visible, but it wasn't able to find the element to assert that it's not visible. So instead of using not visible, it should actually be that this element doesn't actually even exist at this point. So now if I refresh it, we see it all works. Because when I asserted first that this isn't visible, well, it's not that it isn't visible. It's that this element not only is it not visible, but it also doesn't exist in the DOM. So this sci.get was failing because it didn't exist in the DOM. To where here, when we get this element, we're also asserting that it exists in the DOM, so we don't need it exists. Well, we also want to assert that it's visible. But now what do we want to do? Well, let's actually click on this X button here and remove this button. So I don't think let's add another data ID to this button. So let's come back to our sidebar, and that's going to be this button right here is what's going to close it. So let's add data -id is equal to close sidebar btn. And I'm going to copy this data ID. And then we're going to go to our test again. And then now we're going to say sci.get square brackets data ID close sidebar. We're going to click it. And then we're going to assert that the sidebar should no longer exist. So just like this. And we see everything passes here. So we're basically opening and closing the sidebar and asserting that things are working as expected. Now we want to actually test clicking our links. And I'm going to just make this one large test. So it tests navigation, but you could, of course, also do tests. Well, we can split this up actually. So let's go ahead and do that. But you could also make this reasonably one long test, and that would be fine to do. It tests opening and closing sidebar. And then let's make a additional test here to where it tests. And now we're actually going to test navigation. So we're going to still come to our homepage here, but now we're just going to click on the sidebar button. And when we click on the sidebar button, what do we want to do? Well, we want to click on one of our links here and assert that we are on that page for that link. So I'm going to add a data -id equals about -link. And what we're going to do is I'm going to actually just go back to our tests. So we're going to click on open the sidebar, and then we are going to run side.get data ID. And then I think I named it out link. Is that what I named it? Let's go ahead and see. Yeah, about link. So we're going to get this link, and then we're going to click on this link. And then after we click on this link, what we should see is our about page here, which is going to be this page right here. And you can see I have a header on this page, and it has the text about me. So I'm going to, in our test, after we click on this about link, well, for one, after clicking on this link, our sidebar should automatically close. So we're going to click it, and then the sidebar should close after navigating. But we should also assert side.contains, and then this is basically just saying the page contains a certain text. So here we're going to just say it contains about me. Now, you can also pass a regular expression here, which is what I usually do. So instead of just passing the text about me, you can pass a regular expression with // and I can put about me. And then if I put an I behind the final slash here, it's going to make this case insensitive. So it doesn't matter about the case. It's just going to say about me is on this page. So now if I refresh, it's going to run our first test, and then it runs our second test here. But since we're just focusing on our second test, we can use it.only, and this is just going to run our second test here. So now we're only testing this navigation, and we can see we end up on this about me page. We assert that it has about me, and you can see we start at our homepage here. We open our sidebar, we click on the about link, we navigate to the about me page, and then we assert about me exists. Now, it's also would be very fair for us to take this assertion, and here before we click on this about link, we can say that site.contains about me should not exist. And then if we rerun that, everything works as expected. That is how you could set up integration tests or end-to-end tests, in Cypress. Pretty dang straightforward and pretty dang cool if you ask me, because you can see it running in this test runner. You can inspect elements here. If we wanted to test this component in an end-to-end test, we could then start clicking on it here and making those similar assertions that we did for these first two tests. But from here, I'm sure that you can figure out how to test navigating to the settings page and asserting that we have the settings page, but I'll leave that as an exercise to you, as it's basically going to be the same thing as navigating to this about page. But now let's go ahead and set up our component tests here. So I'm going to come back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually kill our test runner. So within our test runner, I'm going to do Control-C, and then I'm going to click clear, and then we're going to run. I actually already forget at this point. Let's look at our package.json. What was this? npm run Cypress open, and then we're going to run this again. But this time we're going to click component tests. And then here it initially says it detects these, but let's go back here for a second. And so for configuring your component tests, it says select component testing in the Cypress app and select Next.js as your front end framework. So what we need to do is we need to switch this to Next.js. We need next step, and then it says to install this. So let's go ahead and do that. And then now that that's installed, we can then click skip. And then now we can click start component testing. To create our first component test, let's actually just click create from component. So let's go to our counter component. We'll start with that, and then I'll go counter. I'll say, okay, run this spec. So you can see it renders our counter here. And let's come back. And now over here within our counter, we see that we have Cypress automatically added a counter .sci.jsx, which is our component test. And this is also why I like to put my components in a folder here. So my counter component is in this folder called counter, because I'm going to have my counter.jsx component as well as my counter.sci.jsx component test. So here you can see the basic test that it gave us is it has our counter component in the describe block, and then it has it blocks here for our individual tests, just exactly what it did for our end-to-end tests here as well. So here it mounts our counter component. So here we can do a very similar thing that we did earlier. So what should we see? Well, after it mounts it, it should have sci.contains, and it should contain the text counter. So let's go ahead and add that, refresh, and it does contain the text counter. But now we should click on these buttons here and decrease them and assert that the counter is working correctly. So to do this, let's go to our counter component, and you can see this is where I render the count. Let's go ahead and add a data-id, and this is going to just be count number. And then we will also add a data ID here on the minus button. So I'll add data ID is equal to minus count btn. And then I'm going to copy this data ID, and then we're going to add the same thing to this plus. So instead of minus, it's going to be plus count btn. Copy the count number data ID, go back to our test, and we're going to say sci.get, so same thing we did earlier, data ID count number dot should, and I think it should be have value that is 0 to start. Let's go ahead and see. Okay, so it doesn't technically have a value here. It's just going to have text. So it should have text that is 0. I think that should be correct. And yes, it is. So we assert that when we start, it has the text 0. But now let's assert that when we click on the plus counter, it increments the count. So let's come back, and now let's get data hyphen or sci.get, and then data ID is going to be our plus count button. So we're going to get that data attribute. And you can also within sci.get, if you want to get just an ID, it's going to be hashtag just like it is in CSS. If you want to get a class, it's going to be dot and then the class name, just like it is in CSS as well. And then any other attribute. So it could be like, a button that has type equals text and different things like that as well. But we're going to get this button and we're going to click on it. And then after getting this button, we're going to assert that the count number is now 1. So let's go ahead and assert that it is now 1. And then refresh. We see that that works. It starts out at 0. We click on the plus icon and it's incremented to 1. And now let's go ahead and copy this line. But now we're going to click on the minus count button and let's spell minus correctly here. And we're going to click on it and assert that the text is now 0. And we see that ran and everything works as expected. So it's a very basic component test to test that our counter, the main functionality, works correctly. But now let's write one more component test here and let's test our to-do list. So if we come back to let's actually come to our running application here. You see, if we go to our settings page, we have our to-do list. So if I go to-do 1, we add a task, to-do 2, we add another task, and we can remove them. So let's test that basic functionality. Let's go ahead and instead of having that test runner create this test, within to-do list, let's create to-do list.sci.jsx. And since we had the file extension of .sci.jsx, that is going to allow us to see this within our test runner here. So if I open up specs here, we see I now have to-do list, but we have no tests within it yet. So let's copy our counter tests here, paste them in here, but now this should be to-do list, and then we should import to-do list here. So we want to mount our to-do list component instead of our counter component. I forget what text we should see here. It should be to-do list. So let's just say to-do list. And then I'm going to remove all this right here. So we do indeed see it mounts this component correctly, and we have our correct assertion here to start. So now what we want to do is type in this input, add a to-do by clicking add task, assert that it's added, and then remove the to-do and assert that it no longer exists. So to do this, let me see. Let's inspect this input. And I think that since this is the only input on our page, we're okay to just use a more general selector here. So let's go ahead and just do sci.get, and then we're going to get the only input on this page, but I need to put it in string form. So get the input, and then we're going to call .type, and then we're going to type to do 1. So let's go ahead and see if that works. And it does. We see that we've typed in to do 1. But now we want to click this add task button. And since it's the only button on our page, I think that we're fine to use a more general selector here as well. So I'm going to say sci.get, and then we're going to get the button, and then we'll just click it. So let's go ahead and do that. And we see that that works. But now we want to assert that we have a to-do 1, and it has a list item. So let's go ahead and maybe we'll say, I actually think that we can just say sci.contains to do 1. And for this UL right here, it has a length of 1 because we have one list item. So within our to-do list, we have this UL here, and I'll give it a data ID. Data ID equals to-do list. And then we can say sci.get, and then I'll say data ID is equal to do list. And then I'll say should have length of 1 after adding that to do. We see that that passes, but before we click add to do, it should have length of 0. So let's make sure that this works. So this didn't work. It says expected you all to have a length of 0, but got 1. So let's actually come back, and I know what's going on here. So we're asserting that we have one unordered list, which is true. We do have one unordered list, which is why this is failing. So what we need to do is within our unordered list, so this is actually a UL that has this data ID attribute. So we can put UL with this data ID. Let's get all the LIs within it. And then that length should be 0. And then all these LIs, we should have one LI. And we see that does indeed fix the issue. And then we can also assert that just sci.contains, and I'll do to do 1, and it contains that text, in which it does. But then before adding that to do, I'm going to say that it should not exist. And you see that that also works. And now we just need to remove this to do here. So let's come back. For this button, I'm going to say, what would be the best way to remove this? So we can potentially have a different amount of tasks. I think the best way is adding a data ID here. And we want to make sure this X button is unique. So I'm going to use a template string, and I'm going to just say task, and then say remove button. So to get this item within our test, I think we should be able to use site.get, and then it should be a data, and make sure to put it in parentheses here or square brackets. Data ID is equal to, well, it should be our to-do one hyphen remove hyphen button. And then we should be able to click on this button, and then our to-do list should now have a length of 0, and we should no longer see to-do one in our page. And we see everything is working correctly here. So we mount our component, and then here we type in a to-do, we add it, we click the X button and assert it is removed. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a rough overview of how you can set up your end-to-end and component tests within Next.js. Of course, there's stuff I didn't cover here, but I think a lot of the stuff I covered at least gives you enough to get started and use a lot of the core functionality of using Cypress within Next.js. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.